Well, hey there, my Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I hope this interview finds you well wherever you are listening or watching it today. And I am in complete awe of the interview I just got to have with Dr. Jennifer Mullan. My body is still buzzing. She is lovingly called the Rage Doctor, and she's so many more things that I don't think this introduction will even do her justice. But one of the things I love about this interview is that she shares so much of herself in our conversation, her wholeness, her humanity, her vulnerability, her why she does the work. It's all there for you to hear. So let me just tell you a little bit more about her. So she is a colonial consciousness crusher, an ancestral wound worker, a scholar activist, an international speaker, an author. She's trained as a clinical psychologist. She's an intergenerational and historical trauma alchemist and a paradigm smasher. She is the author of the upcoming book, Decolonizing Therapy, Oppression, Historical Trauma, and Politicizing Your Practice. It comes out next week, depending on when you're listening to this, on November 7th. And I highly recommend that you consume this book. She offers such a deep gift of powerful truths that need to be shared, that help us think about the ways that racism and inequities and oppression are so embedded in the systems that many of us work in or work with. And we talk about how she really discovered this in her own training and in her own work, and why she is speaking out on this and adding more about what's needed, both from a kind of a macro level down to a micro level. We just barely skimmed the surface because there's so much there in this interview. So you'll have to check out her book. Dr. Mullan was also featured in Allure, GQ, The Today Show, Cosmopolitan, the Calgary Journal, and she received the Essence Magazine's 2020 Essential Hero Award in the category of mental health. And now she's just sitting down with me for our podcast, which is why I'm so grateful. In December 2017, she created the Decolonizing Therapy Instagram, which has grown a really large, enthusiastic following and has helped profoundly shift the world's understanding of therapy and mental health. And that's how I discovered her a few years ago when I started following her. She just shook my world, and I hope she does the same for you in good and needed and powerful ways. So sit back and enjoy. And I hope that you learn and unlearn and relearn with me, as Dr. Jen says. Thank you. Hello, Dr. Jen. It is a true honor to be joining you in conversation today. I am sending you the warmest welcome. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for joining me today on the Attachment Theory in Action podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jenna. It is such a pleasure, and I'm so excited to talk about this.
Yeah, me too. I have been following you on Instagram for several years and just kind of fangirl you and the work that you're doing and the messaging and the truths that you're putting out into the world. They're truths that we need to hear. And so I just, slid into your DMs and you said yes. So I'm just truly so excited that you're here and we can talk about your new book, Decolonizing Therapy, and especially how that relates to attachment.
Yeah.
Before we do, though, I want to bring more of you and your own attachment into this conversation. I mean, it's already there, but let's bring it in with some intention. And so I would invite you to please share an attachment memory that feels important to you and to your work.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I love this question, by the way. I would say one of my fondest memories, and actually my mother was just reminding me of this, going to, I would beg her to go to bookstores, beg. So I was a kid that was indoors a lot for a lot of different reasons. One of them was mostly because my mother felt safer with us indoors unless she was around. And you can imagine growing up how that then became a problem because I wanted to be free. But I did naturally love reading and writing so much. And I had a really, really rich fantasy world where I'd play with like an array of spoons. I'm talking like up until like 10, 11, like we're not talking just little kids. Paper dolls, like I had a really, really rich fantasy world. And I remember begging her around my birthday to go to a bookstore. And she was like, okay, we'll go to the bookstore. And I remember seeing, I think one of the newer, I don't know if it was like Sweet Valley High or Nancy Drew. I was obsessed with all of it. Or Babysitter's Club. I don't even remember. Now I do remember as I'm saying this. Isn't that funny? Wow. It was actually Lord of the Flies. Yeah, that was one of my favorite books. That, The Outsiders, like I was very particular and I would reread other than those series that I mentioned before. So I pick it up and my mother's like, what is that about? And she could see the little violet for you. You're a little young. And I'm like, no. I want to read this. I want to read this. And I said to the woman, she's like, oh, you're a voracious reader or something like that. The person that we were at the checkout. And I said, yeah, I'm going to have a book in here one day too. And the woman says to me, now, mind you, I was born in 1978. So this is happening around the 1980s, right? And the woman goes, oh, well, first you'll be a mom and you'll get married, right? And even at a very little age, I was like, oh, no. That's all like secondary. I don't know if those are my exact words, but like, that's all like after I write my book. Like my mission in this world is to write about things that people need so that they can get better and be happier. And so that's sort of like my attachment memory because mom is always and constantly reading to me growing up, and English is not her first language, but she would practice in her own and also teach me. And then they said at like 4 or 5 years old, when my brother was a baby, I would read to him even though I didn't know the words. And I couldn't really read. I would like remember what my mom said and then like repeat all of that and like come up with characters' names and be very dramatic as I am. So that's my memory. That's my memory. Attachment memory.
Goosebumps already. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Jen. And it sounds like you had a mother who was very supportive of your love of learning and also protective. And I wonder if you could speak more to that, because I feel like there's a lot of that in your work and in your book too.
Yeah. So I suppose that, my mother's side culturally and racially are Black, Latine, like Panamanians, right? And so there's also indigenousness there on my grandmother side, and then on my paternal side with my mother, directly African. And what I find super fascinating is that my grandfather, did all this amazing, like, I think it was like accounting work or something to that nature. Because his stories would always change and be so wonderful and fun out. My grandfather is like my favorite person in the world. He's since passed. But he would always say, like, I came to this country and then brought over your mother and everyone else so that education could be really important. But he would say, even when I didn't understand it, but you have to question everything. Like, don't just take anything at face value. And my mom, on the other end, and she will laugh about this and agree, is much more, her words, not mine, a little bit more chicken, a little bit more like, no, keep it safe. Don't be as problematic. Don't rock the boat. And so I'm sharing this because I think we might be feeling the threat of in my book is growing up with a grandfather who's very clearly saying, these Americans, like, Like, they come into our country, they put down our army bases, and then they take away our income. And he's talking about colonization, right? Like at its core, right? And I remember being in Panama very, very young and going to the store with him and just asking, like, why are there bars on all these houses? Right? Why is there so much of this? Why is there so much of that? And why is there a little boy with a machine gun in the air? Why are people protesting? Right? Like, it was a different world for me than perhaps for others. And so I think my mother wanted to protect me from as much as possible, and also let me know that she had gone through some experiences coming to this country, what is now known as the United States, right? And that it wasn't easy for her, and that she had to, again, not her words, assimilate, in order to fit in, and that she never really felt like she fit in. And so migration trauma to me is really significant, because there is this sense of asking, what is home with a capital H? There is this sense of, is home in a person? Is it in myself? Is it in source, spirit, otherness? Is it in the work that I do? And what does it mean when it feels like I can't either easily go back to my land or place or space where other people mirror me in some way? They might have a different skin color, they might speak a different language, or maybe I don't know my mother tongue, speaking hypothetically. But I do think that there is something there to visiting places and spaces where you do not consistently feel wrong, bad, uglier, unattractive, right? And so for me, that also brings up a lot around, right, children, bullying, right? Where they feel loved, where they feel okay, especially when other folks might not look as, might not look like you, period. I hope I answered your question. I know I kind of.
Yes, I think you really beautifully illustrated this attachment dilemma that a lot of parents and caregivers have, but especially those parents and caregivers who may be BIPOC or may come from communities that have been intentionally neglected and oppressed. And thank you for your book for helping me think about even our languaging around this, where I would normally say, marginalized communities, but saying communities that have been intentionally marginalized. So what I think the dilemma is so challenging, and it just makes me feel for your mom, is that you want to develop and strengthen this secure and loving attachment with your child, and help them to feel safe and seen and loved, and also knowing that the world that she's preparing you to live in, and also her own experiences of her, her own traumas and resiliencies and all of that, impacted as well, that the world may not always be a safe place. It wasn't for her, and it may not be for you because of your skin color or gender or where you came from, all of that. And it's just such a challenge. And I think your book is like a call to action, because I think too often it gets placed on the individual parent or caregiver to solve, like your mom was trying to do.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for beautifully reframing it as well. What this also brings up for me as you're talking is, let me see if I can get the words around this, right? The part of the attachment process in which the caregiver, the parent, is not yet fully, how do I say this without, I'm just fully emotionally developed in a way that is congruent with the country or society or culture in which they're dropping into. Meaning, and again, this isn't, maybe it came across as I'm saying it like a little infantilizing for my mother, and it's not at all, because she's a brilliant, strong woman, but rather she'll frequently say, oh, back home, I got to play a lot. even if I was older, right? Back home, yes, we worked really hard and school was multiple times a day, not just once, right? But then we get to go home. We all got to spend time together and eat together, laugh, argue, whatever it was. The family was important. And so attachment, right? You know, thinking about all of this, that's what I mean. There was so much intelligence there, emotional intelligence, that familial weaving and breeding and kind of like coming together. Yet then coming to the States, she doesn't always utilize these words, but some of what I hear in what she's saying. And then when I ask questions, she's like, yeah, that's right. Or I'm like, I reframe it for her. And she said, and so what I sense is that she had to become adult and serious really fast. Right. She came over about 13 years old, which are significant years, as we know. You know, we're like kind of coming out of the latency age into adolescence. And she also realized that she felt extremely naive and extremely that she had to hide any kind of immigrant status because she could immediately pass, right, as Black American. So then she also had to contend with, wait, what is a Black American? Like, what does that mean to me? Like having to use different terminology and then even deal with her own internalized bias as a migrant. Right. You know, so there was a lot of that happening. And what I noticed as well is there was a sense of she would continue to say, you know, I was very attached to my mommy. She would say this to me a lot. And I thought if I kissed a boy at 15, I would get pregnant. She would tell me this all the time. I was like, wait, you were 15, 16 and you believe this? Like, yes, I did. I know, right? And the thought of this. And so she said, so as you started to grow up and you're asking me very direct questions, as you could guess, I was very precocious and loquacious. And you're like wanting to read things and see things, and you would see something on TV and ask what that's about. And I would blush and, you know, you just picked up on everything. So she would say, you were a little like scientist, psychologist at a very young age. You didn't miss anything. And I said, well, I wonder if that was because I was also protective of you. Right. And so sometimes, you know, me and my mom will joke, this is the first lifetime that I'm the daughter. Maybe that's a different podcast, but
very relevant to attachment. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And her age, like you said, when she migrated to the US, I'm sure some things that got stuck. And so maybe you were trying to help her unstick through your understanding and development, and how, you know, that may have been a gift to your mom, but I also wonder if how that felt for you.
Yeah. I didn't notice because honestly, my mom is such, oh my gosh, I know a lot of people, not everyone, as we know. I know I'm very fortunate and privileged to say that I have an amazing, amazing mom, but I do, you know, and so making our Halloween costumes, hating her when she made me sit down right after school to like do homework every single day. Making me do circles for my penmanship with pencil and paper. Hated it. Crying when we're doing math problems. Math is not my forte. You know, so yeah, I would get in trouble because you can probably guess, like, they would be like, oh, Jennifer's so good in school and so intelligent and her writing is so amazing. However, she doesn't shut up. And we moved her and she keeps talking or she keeps getting out of her seat. And so probably what we understand as ADHD, I had at a very, very young age, very, very young age. And I think that aided my creativity. And so my mother fed that creativity, you know, taking us places, museums, library. I loved a library as a kid, as I said, but I loved being able to have like library circles, listening to someone read, you know, and so I didn't feel it so much as a child because a great deal of, again, thinking about childhood, my attachment needs were met. Food, fresh food every day, even if all she had was like rice and beans and we didn't have money for meat, you know, because my parents were pretty much like maybe working poor, working class, like very working poor, but there were tough times. And so money was always a thing. But I don't think it was until maybe in my teenage years, and early teenage years, early adolescence, where things started to get rough, because I always had a mind of my own. But this time, here I am holding all of this rage that no one is talking about within our family system. And my father is very comfortable with his rage, very opposite of my mom. Right. And here I am acting out my feelings, right? Here I am acting out what I can't talk about. Here I am trying to communicate something that I can feel, but there's no words as far as my life is concerned and the people around me. There was no use your words. There was no, right? There was no, well, it's okay, you can cry. I think I grew up, not everyone, right? But the people around me culturally and generationally, it was very much traditional. We grew up very Catholic, and so that also played a role. And I remember like having to go to catechism classes, and going, I got in trouble for this, by the way. And, and going, and we were doing like, I don't know, is that called like not your first communion, before that, it's like your first penance. And I say to the priest, I go inside and I'm like, he's like, oh, whatever he says to me, like, basically repent, or like, what's your penance? What's your first penance? And I'm like, I don't have one. I'm a kid. This is ridiculous. I'm not getting on my knees in front of you. You're a guy. This is weird.
Good for you.
Right? And I was just like, this is weird. Time out. I want to get out of here. And my mother was like, oh, my grandmother, they almost fell on the floor. They couldn't believe it. Yeah. So, yeah, my adolescence, I was a lot. I got in trouble a lot. I hurt a lot of people. I said a lot. I did a lot. And then I think even into my 20s, it just shifted to psychology. It shifted to counseling. It shifted to, I love this so much. A peer education group saved my life, and not grad school, I'm sorry, undergrad. I talk about it all the time. Years later, I went on to be the facilitator of this group for 13 years. So it was very full circle. But group is my favorite modality. Group, hands down, is my modality. And so I healed in group, and I love witnessing the possibility of healing arise in group, because to me, it shows us that there's the power of attachment and healthy reattachment, right? And healthy connection, without merging with some boundaries, guidelines, hopefully a healthy facilitator or two that is also, role modeling and showing what healthy connection looks like in some ways. And so oftentimes I felt like I was being reparented in that group, as well as then went on. Definitely a lot of them feel like my children or nieces or nephews in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, what a reparative experience. And I think groups offer the ability to do that more in community, because there's a lot that we can do one-on-one, but I think your book also really speaks to this so beautifully, is that we need to be in community, because a lot of these traumas we've experienced collectively as well. So we need to collectively heal them.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I was going to ask you, Dr. Jen, which you already kind of started us on that journey, is that, I introduced you before we started talking about all your credentials, and you are very well educated and well trained as a clinical psychologist, and you've got a lot of work experience working with individuals, families, and communities from all over this country and from other countries. And yet you recognize, because of that training, because of the work you were doing, that there is something really deeply missing. This is not enough. And this is not the full picture. And hearing your background, and that just added so much context. But keep going with this journey and how that has now led to the work that you're doing, the book that you wrote.
Yeah. Thank you. You're such a great interviewer. Can I give you that affirmation? You're a great podcast host.
Speaking my love language. Thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. I'm a words of affirmation person. Yeah. Because you're really making it easy for me to just like unravel it. It's really fascinating. So I would say that it was there at the peer education program because it was facilitated by a clinical psychologist. I think he was a counseling psychologist. He worked at the university, male identified, openly gay identified, and a white man, and we were majority kids of color, right? Majority like Dominican, Puerto Rican, Black Caribbean, Arab, Filipino, like Jersey City, New Jersey, where I grew up is highly like super naturally diverse. We're so close to the city. And there were times that we would sit there in group and look at him and say like, okay, John, are you writing a book about us? Like, why are you asking all these questions? Like, it was so defensive. And I definitely came into undergrad with a chip on my shoulder, feeling like I'm not going to get far. I'm not going to go to school for a long time. Haha, joke's on me. And instead, I was an education major with, let me see if I can get this right. Oh my gosh, feels like eons ago, my 20s, right? I was a elementary ed and education major. And then I shifted to secondary ed and English. And then I realized, what am I doing? I'm in love with psychology. Like I am so deeply in love with this. It doesn't feel like I'm having to learn. It feels like I just get to be who I am. And I think that I was already a very highly sensitive child. I'd cry when we would see like dead animals on the side of the road. I would cry deeply when like the end of a book series was finishing. I still do. I don't hide it this time. So I think that I was already extremely neurodivergent. And at the same time, I saw things. I knew things, and so I don't think that they always believed me. And I don't think the world believed me. But here I came into this peer ed group. And of course, I didn't give any of that right away, right? No time soon, not even in a year and a half. But I slowly started to allow some of the armor to melt at a pace that was often good for me, but often where the group facilitator, John, was pushing my growing edge. Not just me, but many of ours. And my relationship with others allowed me to see that there's other ways of being that are not snarky all the time or nasty. Or like I started looking up to my peers that actually seemed to know how to do relationship. Right. And because of my own childhood trauma and the ways that I was engaged with as a child, I assumed that love always equated that there's going to be some sort of hurting and then apologizing, and there's like a cycle and there's drama and it's intense and I was on a track to feeling like, well, I just don't trust and like guys, like I was on this track of like evil and all my rage was directed that way. But John started to give me a really reparative experience, and was just like never loud or inappropriate or harmful and if someone disagreed, he would listen, reflected back. There was also a humanity. So he was already shifting the model, I think, in psychology and work, right? But gently, it was a little different. So then fast forward years later, I'm in partial care, UMDNJ, Rutgers Medical School in Newark, and then moving on to my APA internship in Syosset, Long Island. Excuse me. And I was working primarily with youth. This was a residential who had sexually assaulted someone or raped someone in very violent ways. Prior to that, in California, one of my big internships was working with adults that had harmed in violent ways, difficult resistant deniers, air quotes. That was like one of my groups. So in some ways, I was working through unconsciously all of the trauma that I had experienced, right? Or trying to figure things out without realizing it. I was always like, even at UMDNJ, I was working with children. Some of the most heinous trauma I'd ever heard in my life. And they would come in, you get off me. No, time out. Can't talk to me like that. Okay, take a step out. We can come back in. When you probably know how it is. We had a reward system. It was very CBT, but I was constantly conceptualizing psychodynamically is how I understood it. Right? That's how I would say in my interviews, right? And it was true. Narrative therapy came into my life. Psychodrama came into my life. I would go to psychodrama conferences. I would present. What I knew and understood through the peer education group, through my own healing, because part of that peer ed group was us doing interactive skits with other college students across the country. And we were a nationally recognized group. We had an acting coach come in with us. We here we are, quote unquote, inner city kids who are quote unquote probably at risk for all the grants that John was writing for us. Right? Like we shouldn't have been in college for all intents and purposes. In a college with professors that actually loved our grittiness, loved what we brought, saw our intelligence, gave us more books and education to foster whatever was there in us. And through that peer education group, through our semester retreats, things got deep. Our Wednesday meetings were not just staff meetings. We're talking about parent wounds. We're talking about, rage and anger and doing the like alcoholic life raft. And what happens if there's someone in your family that's an alcoholic and what does that look like? And we're doing exercises and psychodrama and talking to empty chairs, probably very gestalt also. We're doing the work. People are sobbing, crying. And then here I was 13 years later, finishing internship, coming back into Jersey, getting married, and taking on a peer education group and doing therapy at the counseling center, and teaching classes for multicultural counseling and group process for their master's program, counseling master's and undergrad, and running an LGBTQIA support group and right, university.
Is that all?
Right? I'm sure you could identify. Yes. So I'm doing all of that for one pay, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I realized that me and my students, right, like constantly going back and forth, like I was always able to separate myself, but I was also a big journaler and really big on looking at the implicit and explicit process as well as what was happening. And, I was really fascinated by all of that. And these students became closer and closer. I realized how violent it was to try to just completely cut myself off from individuals whose lives I'd been such a major part of, right? Help almost reparent them, essentially. And that I was hanging out with them or going and just, or partying because I was younger. There were still boundaries, but I was able to continue to allow myself to unravel and unpack just a bit and get away from this like staying safe, air quotes, with like being completely neutral all the time, completely sort of, I don't know what the word is, amorphic, sort of just like I don't have feelings, I don't have sense, I don't have this, I don't have like, I do. Yeah. Like constantly putting it back on them. What does that mean to you? What would it mean to you if I was a Leo rising? What would it mean to you? And I started realizing that there were some aspects of this that were actually harmful. And I would bring it into our case conferencing. And I would say, like, here are individuals. I was also talking about myself, right? Because I was ready. I was in therapy forever, at that point. And doing a lot of spiritual work, a lot. And a lot of ancestral work, because it's not always one and the same. And I remember saying in a staff meeting, we didn't always agree. And we all had different perspectives and we were a lot of different identities, right? Here we are with students, right, of all ages that are actually for the first time in their lives, very involved in therapy, in working on themselves, and in caring for other people, right? And this is the first time in their lives that they're actually speaking out. They're becoming role models. They're going to class. They're passing entrance exams. They're thinking about, wait, what if I do art instead of math? What if I, what if I combine the two? What would that look like? They're coming to therapy with half of you, right? They're like, all of this growth, like they're setting boundaries with their parents, even though they might have to live in the household with some of these violent caregivers. They're doing this, or they're getting into the dorms because it's so violent, whatever it is. They almost have like an extended family in us, a boundaried one, but an extended family. Mm-hmm. And we're supposed to just like cut them off, or you don't want me to answer anything about like my childhood, or you like, I'm just supposed to act as though I am not a full person. Mm-hmm. And that block, and I said, well, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm just letting you all know. And I will come in and process this, but it feels violent. And it feels as though it's continuing to re-trigger this sort of, I don't know the word I want to use, this sort of like removed, absent parent. I'm the parent, you're the child, you do what I say. Mm-hmm. And I was very clear, I wasn't their parent, but I was providing skills and helping them grieve the loss of a parent, even if the parent was alive. Mm-hmm. We talk about it all the time, And sometimes we would draw about it, right? Sometimes where's your mother in your body? Let's draw that out. Where does that feel like, right? I was very much that kind of therapist, that kind of psychologist. And I remember my boss, who was a elder and a Black woman, would say, I trust you. Do it. I trust you. Like, everyone's coming to me and they're changing, they're expanding, they're evolving, they're talking to me more. Like, and then eventually the rest of my team, like, I don't know how you're doing what you do, but go ahead, Jenna. And then we were bringing in culture. Then I was bringing in people to talk about colorism, even if 5 of the people at the retreat that were my students were white. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about this. You're going to learn about this. Even if it's not about you, it's okay to not center whiteness or white people all the time. What if we centered us, right? And sometimes we didn't, right? Like, okay, now I'm going to bring in someone on the retreat and we're going to talk about queerness and queer identity and queer sex. And right now we're going to talk about this. Now we're going to talk about denial and parent wounds. Now we're going to do a rage retreat, right? And so I think through my peer educators, I realized very quickly that we heal on a deeper level in community because our original attachment wounds occurred when we were being removed or asked to leave community settings. Not that things never happened in community, right? Not that community members never harmed us. But when you think culturally, globally, if we can get macro for a second, this massive realization was hitting me. And I'm probably not alone. I think my students too, they were just using different words. Right. And this is for my one-to-one students too. Like I was seeing so much here where the more that we brought in like the generational component to their substance abuse issues, more that we brought in the generational or the ancestral component to abuse of the feminine or abuse of the body of the feminine, right? Or, sometimes they would say, no, Dr. Jen, I want to call it what it is. We're going to call it rape. Okay, then we're going to call it, yeah, right? Or whatever it is, every time I brought in, is this ours or is this something that we've learned? Mm-hmm. Or is it both, right? Does it become ours now, right? And what do we do with it if it's ours now? How do we take responsibility for it? Do we not? Do we look at it? Do we name it? What do we want to do with this, right? And so I think that a lot of the people I worked with over the years would say, I probably wouldn't say this. They would say, or I've heard it from them, you made therapy alive for me, alive. Like you brought it alive for me, where it wasn't just a mind exercise, which sometimes they need that, right? Sometimes I'm, no shade at all to cognitive distortions and looking at, all of that, because I had that hung up in my office. It's like, where are we? Where are you minimizing? Are we black or white thinking? Mm-hmm. But I do feel particularly people of the global majority and individuals that, are neurodiverse, individuals that are queer identified, like people that have been othered and are very clear of their otheredness and can get harmed or killed or deported or any of those things for their otherness, right? There's a risk. There's a racial trauma, perhaps, or a gender trauma, some kind of component there. I find that there is a drawnness to groups, and there's a drawnness, being drawn to wanting this emancipation, like wanting to be liberated in some way and desiring. And so at this time, I'm also getting politicized, right? And working with various groups and students or people that are a little bit younger than me, majority of them, some Filipino identified, some that are Arab, some Black, and they're teaching me about neoliberalism and my education. They're teaching me they're like, no, do you understand what white body supremacy is? And okay, let's break this down. How does that show up here? And then I was also taking Undoing Racism trainings with People's Institute of Survival and Beyond. My old mentor, Dr. Susan Eskelin, who's a genius, particularly in child adolescent mistreatment, forensics, Jewish identified woman, really, really, really changed my life and was like, Jen, you got to come to these Undoing Racism trainings. I'm like, Sue, I love you, but these trainings are not going to teach me anything I don't know. And she's like, no, it's going to give you language. And it did. And it gave me examples. And you probably hear in the book, I talk about them a lot because I like to give people credit where it's deserved. Yes. But I've been talking a lot. So let me just say, in wrapping this up, this part up, is that what I realized deeply, that people heal deep-rooted attachment, historical ancestral attachment wounds in community with others. And it doesn't look like we're, as you know, holding hands and we're skipping away and we all love each other. Kumbaya. It looks like conflict, right? Even with colleagues. Mm-hmm. Right? It looks like conflict sometimes. It looks like someone is avoided and someone is like, wait, why are you avoiding? Why are you this? Why are you that? Are we okay? And someone's moving towards. The other thing I realize is that we need to have our histories validated. That yes, I understand that a lot of trauma conscious work now is saying like, well, we don't want to have someone repeat their stories. And I would agree that too soon or too much is very violent for everybody. And there is something to be said about working out that trauma history, whether yours or your parents. Not that you're working it out, but you're having an understanding of it, yeah? Or your ancestry, right? Whether we're talking about attempted genocides, whether we're talking about completely, Holocaust, whatever we're talking about, right? Armenian genocides, Rwandan genocides, right? Wars in El Salvador, we can keep going on. Yes. But when I would have students connect that, or people I was working with like, oh, wow, I was born in blah, 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 blah. At that time, there was a war in this place. Oh, wow, there was a takeover. And all these people of my religion were slaughtered at this time. Mm-hmm. How interesting. What do you think it was like for your mom to be carrying you and be 9 months with you while there were bombs outside of her window? Mm-hmm. Or while her sister was being harmed and pulled out of the house and right? And I found that once people were ready to tell their stories using some form of art or dance or song, or sometimes just sitting in the middle of a circle and making eye contact, which is something they've never done in their lives years prior, that sometimes an audience is required, right? I think that's why we have love songs and blues songs and spoken word poetry, right? And of course, the audience has to be willing to, or the group has to be willing to contain it. And the other piece is there's an unlearning process that I believe we all need to go through. And that's where I really started understanding the decolonial process, and that if many of us were extracted, removed forcibly or not from our homelands, not everybody, but many of us, including some people that have come to be known as white, mm-hmm. right? And if items were extracted, minerals, resources, gold, diamonds, whatever, or people are harvested, or people are their number one export, right? Like in the Philippines, people are number one export, right? To go to other countries to be nurses and flight attendants and this and that. And so in that way, how does that impact our attachment? How does that impact how we see ourselves? How does that start to impact our needing to get closer to whatever we understand as more powerful And 9 times out of 10, that might be whiteness in all of its supremacy, right? And how have we learned that we're only as worthy as what people or them they can extract from us, right? And if I'm constantly used to being worthy or thinking that I'm only worthy for what I can offer, then I'm going to overwork, then I'm going to overgive, then I might not notice red flags when something in a relationship is a no-go, right? Then I might work and expect someone to say, hey, I'm going to pay you this amount of money, do less. That'll never happen, right? Right? And so our bodies become inflamed, our emotions become inflamed, our relationships become inflamed, right? And it becomes almost impossible to feel safe, whatever that means for us, in our bodies, in our relationships, sometimes even within our own minds. And I would see that with kids all the time when I work with them, right? Like parents are like, fix them. They didn't say that, but essentially some of them did.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, well,
wave your wand.
Right. Right. And it's like, well, they're doing great now in group. Here we are 8 months later. So now this behavior is only showing up at home. Can we talk about what that might be about? Right. So yeah, what I want to say is that this emotional decolonial process, as I've been calling it, isn't trying to replace the land decolonization, right? Or like that whole process. But it is rather an invitation to look at where we're being asked to tamper down our big emotions, where we're being asked to be in closer proximity to whiteness or Eurocentricity, how we've been educated, who have been the main theories, professors, teachers, theorists, practices. And so in this emotional decolonial process, the invitation is to start to unlearn, is to start to question everything, is to start to look at how we've been taught to be separate from one another, from the land, from our big feelings like grief and rage, and that we're not just dealing with what is happening currently. We are currently daily digesting our own childhood and adolescent experiences, as well as those that have not been able to be metabolized from our lineages. Yeah.
There's so much there, Dr. Jen. One place it makes me go is first, just thank you for sharing so openly and vulnerably. And the gift that you received of these adults and mentors who saw your full humanity, and how you were then able to give that back in these groups and with others, and recognizing that, no wonder one-on-one CBT is not going to solve this. And that there's so much more, and it would, I'm sure that whiteness would want us to stay small and not address this, but our mental health systems, our school systems, so many systems were built and it's embedded, and that we have to, like you said, and I love that you say this in your book as well, we have to, it's this ongoing process of learning, unlearning, relearning, because what was there already wasn't sufficient, and it wasn't capturing the full story. So thank you for helping just kind of broaden, and especially from that attachment lens. It's like we can't talk about attachment without factoring in the ways that systemic, collective, and ancestral attachment losses and traumas have impacted. It's not only just the one-on-one relationships, which is often, how we think about attachment, how the research has been done on attachment. So your stories just really helped bring that to life. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I also wanted to quickly say, like especially for children, and we know how sensitive their nervous systems and brains are, right? And how sensitive everything, especially before the age of 3, when they're pre-verbal, right? And I remember a supervisor really teaching me about the insidiousness, I don't know if that might, of trauma pre-verbally. Yeah. And this is one of the challenges of working with that kind of pre-verbal trauma and how that might show up. And I remember asking, well, what about like kids? This is like 20-something-year-old Jen, right? Like, I was like, well, okay. Well, what about those of us that are like direct descendants to like the transatlantic slave trade? And like my supervisor was just like, eyes big, like, oh, and no shade on her, and I was like, well, what about individuals that are descendants of such and such and this and this and that, and like, how does someone being identified as quote unquote illegal impact who they are and how they walk in the world? Because a human being can't be illegal, right? Like what? I would ask all these questions. And I wouldn't get in trouble, but I did have this reputation for kind of pushing a bit, right? And that I wouldn't just be able to like let it go, And so all of this to say, I deeply, deeply love these fields. I've dedicated hundreds of thousands of dollars and a lot of my life to these fields. But what I love more is people. I love watching humanity evolve. I love the ways that we try to continue to grow. There's also a billion horrendous things. Yeah. But above all, I do have faith in humanity. Above all, I have faith in the power of healing because I've witnessed it. Right? I've witnessed people that should deeply despise each other and have in restorative justice circles, people that have harmed each other's family members, killed each other's family members, find a place of, I don't know if I'm a forgiveness, but I'm definitely at a place where I'm not ready to retaliate. I don't want to do this to my life. I don't want to do this to your life. You're human. This occurred and it's complicated and I'm effing enraged and I want to live, right? And I don't want this to go on to my children. I don't want to infect them with what it feels like is this virus, right? This psychological enslavement. And I feel like when a people have insight, understanding, and education about themselves, when they know who they are, where they're from, prior to the point of trauma, prior to the point of, okay, well, like Africans were taken, like, okay, and what about before that? And what about what's happening now? Africa's super rich in a lot of resources, intelligence, technology. Like, why do we only have this like one single story about a people? Right. And why do we keep on telling it? Well, we know why. Because it benefits certain people. So I find that when we bring together the good, the bad, the ugly of a people and our peoples, and don't just say like, oh yeah, we got to talk about oppression and racism. No. I, as a therapist, you as a therapist, we're going to look at how our people have contributed to harm. We're going to look at how our people may have been harmed. We don't have to get stuck there. We don't have to roll around in it for years, but we do, I believe, in order to really heal and have inner and outer revolution, need to address it and acknowledge it. Because as we know, therapeutically, what happens when we don't acknowledge massive grief, rage, harm, right? It just grows, right? It doesn't metabolize in our bodies. It makes us sick. We continue to be engaged in the same behaviors. So all of this to say, I think we owe it to one another, particularly within our fields, whether we're teachers, therapists, nurses, coaches, practitioners, we owe it to ourselves to be loving investigators of our own histories. Right? We owe it to ourselves and who we work with or serve to hold one another lovingly accountable. That doesn't mean I have to like cuss you out or, it means, hey, no, wait, that was a microaggression. That didn't feel good. Time out. Wait, like, I know we're friends, but like, I didn't like that. Can we talk about that? Right. Or that even means taking space from each other when things happen and we can't talk about it yet. but it does mean learning how to have more conflict resolution, right? And learning what our ancestors brought that was magnificent, that we're taught to, that is like gross or icky or too primal or, ooh, that's weird. Or, oh, wait, you guys do what? You arrange marriages? Oh, like, all of that. Even I did it as a kid. I was taught, right? I was conditioned socially that this American way was the right way. And that's what we were going to do. And so, yeah, this book is a love letter and a call to action to like, we got to do it different. There's some things that are expired. There's some things we could still use for now. But what would true healing look like that is almost bilateral? Because many of us are burned out, massive caseloads, tons of vicarious and secondary trauma. Teachers too, right? Like sometimes 40 kids in classroom. Like, how do we make sure that they're well and we're passing on the knowledge or the help or the resources we have? And how do we also make sure that we're not going home to like just a bottle every night or, or just like over exercising and not talking to anyone or working again for another 5 hours because we have notes and reports to do? Like, how do we ensure that we stay well and alive? Because in a lot of our villages, what we do now, food was made for us. Or maybe someone tended to the rip in our clothes, right? Because there was like bartering. There was a sense of community. Like, oh, this is our village helper, curandero, shaman, priest, I don't know, priestess. Like, this is our village helper, right? You just came back from war. They're going to be with the family now for a couple of months. We're going to take care of them too. So how do we reintegrate with society when we've been taught that we need to sort of be this like amorphous, unfeeling, emotionally euthanized, which is not true, person? That's like my goal, for us to start shifting it, make it more equitable, make it more conscious, and allow for there to be less violence as a whole in the work that we do.
Well, sign me up. I am on board. And I think you talked too about when these feelings of grief and rage and all the things go unacknowledged. Not only do those come out then in other ways, and we're not naming it, we're not normalizing it, and it's really just adaptations for survival, but we also I mean, and I know I've been part of that too with my own privilege and with working within different systems. We pathologize it.
Yes.
And we make it more about that individual person.
Yeah.
What's wrong with you, versus what's wrong with the systems. And there's so much of that in your book. So I know we're just kind of skimming the surface. But that so much of our lineage, as you've talked about, those unrecognized traumas and attachment losses and all of that, like, it's okay to express those, but we also need the practitioners to know better how to deal with that and to work in systems that aren't so constrained, and how to deal with their own stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes we think by the time you've arrived as whether it's social worker, counselor, or teacher, that it's like now you're in this place of all knowing. And that's when all of our stuff gets stirred up too. They don't teach us that in school. So
right? They teach us that. They teach us to be that way with each other. And I'm going to say this lovingly. This is a little bit of a like tongue-in-cheek joke. Sometimes my hardest audiences are therapists, right? that are brilliant, that are great at their theories or what they do or how they practice, but trying to like allow in a crack and trying to get in a new way of seeing things and a new possibility. I almost feel this like, oh, no, you're not going to teach me, particularly my identities, who I am. Maybe perhaps I look younger than what I am. And I talk a little bit more down to earth. There's more relationality in how I engage. I'm not just spewing numbers all the time. And I can do that. But that's the point of being 45 and no longer working for an institution, right? That I get to unlatch from coloniality's claw sometimes, right? Like not all the time. It's still within me, right? But I get to think about what would be most healing and what would be most healing for me. And I don't think that's selfish for therapists or healers, helpers, teachers to think about like, what do I need to make this work a little bit more enjoyable after doing it for this many years?
Mhm.
Right. And how do I connect more? How do I be more down to earth? And for me, that's just being more of myself and
Mhm.
bringing more of that in.
Yeah, and it helps dismantle some of those power differentials, especially the way that, like I said, the mental health system has been set up. And your book really made me think about this deeper too, because I remember, especially as a young therapist, because like you said, that's how we're taught. We don't self-disclose, and like feeling this disconnect from my own
Mm.
self about how can I be me in help if I'm not allowed to be me. And like you said, that doesn't mean that we don't do that with boundaries, but that we have to fully show up in our authenticity, and that way we can connect, like genuinely connect, not
Yeah.
connect with this wall up,
Mhm.
and so I like I said, just will continue to thank you for this book and for your work, because it just names all of this so, so powerfully and so beautifully. Another way that, and I know we have to start to wrap up, unfortunately, but I want to share another way that your book touched me is, it's not just professionally, because like I said, this whole, professional, personal, keep them separate, that's the old paradigm. And so as I was reading your book, I talk a lot about my maternal grandmother being, when I talk about my attachment memories, who comes up for me, and in your book you talk about home, this deep sense of safety and feeling seen and loved and appreciated. That for me is my grandmother. And not that she was perfect, and I got a different version, and that's the whole intergenerational, ways that things get passed on and then also healed as you learn as you go, because my mother and her siblings got a much different version. But the version that I received, even though like I said, she wasn't perfect, she was an alcoholic, she could be very, very critical, luckily not of me, but when she would drink, she could be of just that critical, energy of others. But she still offered me a lot of love and safety and security and predictability. But the thing your book helped me recognize too is she was the historian in our
Mm.
family. And
Mm.
so she would tell all the stories of my ancestors and what she came to know of my grandfather's ancestors. And sometimes, she would tell them at nauseum, where you're like, Grandma, I've already heard this story, how elders can do. And I'm now starting to think like maybe that's intentional. Like we just think they're old and they can't remember that they've already shared it. But no, they want this to land. They have that inner wisdom somewhere, whether they're conscious of it or not, and they want it to land. And so, now my grandma's passed away, and I just would give anything to be able to hear more of those stories, because I think we are all longing for more of that understanding, because it helps us feel, get to know ourselves better on this much deeper level and understand. And I had a quote from your book that I was going to. Oh, I've got so many notes all over the place, but your book had a beautiful quote about, the ways that this helps, normalize, and we move out of that shame, we move out of that place of fear and victimization, and now we feel seen, and we do that by connecting to our history. And so your book really helped enlighten me on that. So I thank you for that. And
Yeah.
so many other things that are in this book. I think it's, like I said, a gift, and it may be a gift that we're not all ready to receive too, because you speak truths that we need to hear. Maybe we need to hear it in like bite-sized chunks.
Yep.
Maybe we need to process it in community, as you've talked about so much in this interview. But we need it because we need to shake things up. We need disruptors like you, Dr. Jen, and I'm so grateful. I'm just curious if there's anything you want to send us off with, anything you want to say or share besides your book, because it's releasing next week, and I hope that our audience will go out and consume it because it's amazing.
Thank you. Well, number one, thank you for having me. Thank you for voraciously reading it, and I'm like, trying to get through as much as you could because it is a lot. I will say that I hope that people will allow themselves to be drawn to chapters that feel the most like, oh, no, I know all about that. Or I don't need to read more about that. Or, oh, rage, grief, don't have those problems. Nope, not me. Or energy boundaries. Why do I need that? Right. Or diagnostic enslavement. Right. So my hope is that you allow yourself to land where you're supposed to land. Sometimes I don't read books from beginning to end, right? Like, that's how my neurodivergence works. Sometimes I like to go in one particular place or just open it and just like get in. So I invite people, if you're not interested in like the more historical parts, then maybe move to section 2, right? The trunk, right? Instead of, the roots but if you're interested in another area, allow yourself to also be challenged and allow yourself, if you're reading it, to be willing to change. Yeah. Because I find that our need to know everything and our need to have it already figured out, that there's nothing possibly left for me to learn in this area or that area, is really damaging and it's harmful. And I guess the call to action I want to provide is that I think our youth meaning 20s and under, are really onto something with this new world, right? And how they understand things, fluidity, emotionality, right? Highly emotional. And I think that they're showing us where it's a strength. I think they're showing us where there is no space and place for more oppression and genocide and violence. I think they're showing us that they're not ready to just lay down quietly. I think that these youth growing up in this world are telling us that something needs to change. And I hope that we go in our field from a place of general alienation to deep emancipation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I know we say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, but it's not a marathon either, because marathon has an end. But we have to take care of ourselves on the marathon. We have to fuel up. But we have to recognize that this is ongoing.
Yeah.
And I like I said, just want to continue to express my deepest gratitude for the work that you're doing in this book. I found the quote, so this might be a good way to end our time together, although I wish we could keep going on and on. But when we understand the origins, we can begin to release shame, self-blame, feelings, and behaviors of unconscious victimization and fear. And so many more beautiful wisdom nuggets in your book. So thank you so much, Dr. Jen, for joining me today. I look forward to continuing to learn and unlearn and relearn from you and with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this podcast, the work you do in the world. And thank you, everyone, for listening in. You're appreciated.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.